Okay, so
Bravo.
the webinar is now broadcasting to all participants, and I'd like to welcome all of you. I don't have an exact number of what we have so far on the screen. The number seems to be increasing. Looks like the stock market, hopefully, is going now to 86, 90. So as people come in, I think we'll probably give them a few seconds because it looks like they're bringing people in from this waiting room into the call. So I prefer to allow for a few seconds until we reach the 200 odd 300 people that we have. We are now at I guess the speakers, the panelists can see the number. Can you guys see the number that is coming up on the screen, or that's not something that you see? You must see all of it, no? There's a number of participants at the bottom of the screen.
Ah, yes, 166.
166.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, it's 166. This is what we have. I think that at this point, probably 68 people keep coming. We slow down to a trickle, I think, as people sign in. But I think that we should get started because we're 3 minutes into the call, at least according to my watch or my telephone. So welcome on behalf of Michael Melling and myself. Welcome to the European Roundtable webinar entitled "The Politics of Border Carbon Adjustment in the Green Deal," subtitle "Dream or Reality." That the dream or reality, I will not claim paternity to the dream of reality. I think that was more of your contribution, Michael, I think, to the dream of reality. So this is going to be moderated alternatively by Michael and myself. I'm the executive director of the Roundtable. Michael is one of the people together with Aaron Cosby that are working on the project which this webinar is part of. Also a board member of the European Roundtable. Now, the European Roundtable has for a long time presented the thesis that the Paris Agreement's great strengths, the bottom-up approach, present the risk of asymmetrical climate change policy, which is not a great novelty. We start seeing that with the EU taking the lead on a very ambitious target being proposed, 50, 55, 60, 65 by 2030. Climate neutrality by 2050 and carbon neutrality in the ETS way before that, maybe 2040. These are very ambitious targets. This creates a real risk of carbon leakage and competitive impacts. This was addressed so far through measures such as free allocation in the EU ETS and through some unforeseen events such as the financial crisis. Coronavirus notwithstanding, many studies show that free allocation may, under certain scenarios, not be a viable alternative post-2028, meaning that at some point we're going to run out of free allocation, potentially, and there are certain measures, something called the cross-sectoral correction factor, may have to come into force. That's debatable depending the modeling that you do. We need to therefore consider new approaches, and the border carbon adjustment has been put forth politically by the President von der Leyen in her July political guidelines, and in her mission letter to several commissioners, including Paolo Gentiloni. Some of you member states are asking that this BCA start at an earlier stage than currently envisaged. ERCST is currently examining the issues of the mechanism, the carbon adjustment, the mechanism for carbon border adjustment, a new acronym, through a project entitled Border Carbon Adjustment in the EU Issues and Options, which is funded by a number of member states, Germany and France, and a number of business organizations. This discussion that we're having today is part of that project, as well as our feedback to the Inception Impact Assessment, which is the roadmap for examining this new mechanism. We'll start with the first segment, which will be a number of questions that Mike and I will alternate with the panelists. The panelists, as you have seen, they're quite eminent and prominent people and well known from around the world. We thank them very much for participating in this, taking the time in this virtual seminar. Arunabha Ghosh, who is the CEO of the Council on Environment, Water, and Energy. Rodolfo Lacey, Director for the Environment Director at OECD. Geneviève Ponce, Director General of the Jacques Delors Institute in Europe. Jake Wexman, who's the Principal Advisor in DG Clima and the lead negotiator for the European Union in UNFCCC negotiation. David Banks, Chief Strategist for the Minority Policy and Communication Climate Select Committee, U.S. House of Representatives. And John Cooper, who's the Director General for Fuels Europe. So people that have thought about these things, people that have been involved in this discussion and have a deep and long-standing interest in the topic of border carbon adjustment, climate policy, and trade policy. I will start with Jake. Jake, you are an advisor to the EU's Director General for Climate Action. The EU and the European Commission, at least in my estimation, and you feel free to disagree with this, doesn't seem to have been very keen in the past to the border carbon adjustment, which was briefly considered under phase 4 ETS reviews and then dropped. However, President von der Leyen has put it politically and its credibility behind it. A couple of questions to it that you may want to attend. One of them is, can you tell us what has led to this change in the EU and European Commission change of heart? What would be the main avenues that you would explore for a CBAM? And is hedging against carbon leakage limited to this option for the EU? So the questions really lead to, why now? What has changed? Is something that in the past, at least in my experience in Brussels, has not been a high priority or the love of anybody's life. And if you are looking at carbon leakage, border carbon adjustment is potentially one approach, there may be others. Are you strictly limiting to this, or the Commission is in its proposal limiting itself to this, or is open to further discussion? Jake? So you're gonna have to mute yourself, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andre and Michael and the Roundtable for organizing this discussion. It's not the first conversation that you've organized amongst experts and policymakers on this topic, but it is the first one, at least that I've participated in, that's happening after the European Green Deal announcement and the Commission proposal to explore a border carbon adjustment measure. So from that sense, it's become a little bit less academic and a little bit less abstract. We're now dealing with a concrete situation where a proposal is being developed. At the same time, because of that, there's less than I can say as a Commission official of great specificity, because this is a policy proposal that is very much under consideration at the moment. So I see my role here really is to listen to the experts, to take notes, and to feed those back into the process. Obviously, the big thing that has changed, you asked what has changed in terms of the Commission coming forward with this proposal, is the rest of the European Green Deal communication, which contains many aspects of environment and sustainability, but has as its core these very ambitious climate change policies that will lead the European Union towards climate neutrality by 2050. And so it's in that context that the Commission has proposed that should differences in levels between our ambition and the ambition of our trading partners persist, that the Commission would propose a border carbon adjustment measure for selected sectors to reduce the risk of carbon leakage. It will be designed, this measure, to ensure environmental integrity and the effectiveness of the measures that we put in place, which obviously will only have the desired environmental impact if not just the EU, but all countries move towards climate neutrality as they've committed to do under the Paris Agreement. It will be put in place as an alternative to other measures that are currently being used to address carbon leakage under the ETS. And it will be put in place in a way that is consistent with our obligations under international trade rules, and in particularly the WTO. The process for designing this new piece of legislation is underway, and the participants in this conference might want to look on the website of the Commission for the roadmap, which sets out some of the answers to the questions that you've asked about how we will be weighing up this new measure, the context in which we will do that. The first important point I think to make is that the part of the Commission that's responsible for moving this proposal forward is TaxUD. It's not DG Klima, but DG TaxUD, which is that part of the Commission that's responsible for taxation-related policies. They are in the lead. And what's called an inception impact assessment has now been published, and a feedback period has begun. It started on the 4th of March and will run to the 1st of April, in which members of the public can provide their initial reaction to the description of the impact assessment terms of reference that are on that website. There are about 25, I think, that have commented on this so far and provide their initial feedback. Most of them Europeans, most of them from European industry, but some European citizens as well. And I would say that just from a quick scan of them, most of them have been very positive and encouraging for the Commission to move forward with a border carbon adjustment mechanism proposal. This will now then move into a public comment period in the third quarter of 2020, with a view to the Commission adopting a proposal in the second quarter of 2021. And at that stage, obviously it would move into the legislative process where the Council and the European Parliament would have to endorse the outcome before it became part of European legislation. The assessment process will look at a number of different options. It will look at the kinds of policies that, policy instruments that could achieve the effects that a border carbon adjustment measure is intended to achieve. So it will be looking at, for example, a carbon tax, a customs duty, or some extension of the existing ETS. It will also look at different methodological approaches, which I know the other panelists will be addressing in more detail, to evaluating carbon content of products that might be subject to an adjustment, as well as the way in which carbon can be seen as being priced in the countries of origin of those products. And so that could include benchmark values, but also opportunities for importers that wanted to challenge the benchmarks to explain why it is that they think that their product is being produced in a more climate-friendly way. The assessment will also look at options for sectoral scope, and it will look at different kinds of impacts, economic impacts, social impacts, environmental impacts, as well as the administrative costs of those impacts. The context in which the impact assessment will take place will include looking at existing policies that are, the revision of which is also underway. So as you can imagine, with the EU moving, the Commission proposing that the EU moves to a more ambitious target than we currently have, from at least 40% to 50 to 55%, that will require an adjustment of the ETS. And so an impact assessment of that adjustment will be part of the context in which the border carbon adjustment measure will be assessed, as will be proposals for the revision of the energy tax directive and other policies that will be relevant to the implementation of the European Green Deal. So the impact assessment has to take place in a very dynamic policy context where other pieces of the Green Deal are being put in place. In terms of the evidence base and the data that the impact assessment will look at, it will look at past experience with the ETS in terms of managing carbon leakage. And it will also look at the way in which the OECD and other researchers have looked at effective carbon tax rates or pricing rates in other economies. This will be followed up by a stakeholder consultation. And as I said, at the end of the day, this impact assessment will be part of the basis on which the Council and the European Parliament will debate whatever Commission proposal is provided at the end of the day. So that's an initial reaction again, and in some constraints, as I explained, I can't have my academic hat as I've had on in previous conversations, but have to respect that this is a Commission policy proposal that is still in the making. Thanks very much.
Jake, one follow-up question that we've got quite a few people wondering about that is we are in a special situation. I think it's quite obvious that this is not a normal situation, but normally we would all be in the same room, or many of us would be in the same room. Given this constraints, will this in any way impact the timing in terms of the feedback period and in general the impact assessment? Is there any consideration being given to that right now?
By the current constraints, you mean the COVID crisis, whether that will delay or the various procedures that are associated with the proposal? Is that the question?
That's right, yeah.
My understanding is that no sort of overarching decision has been made on that. This is something that the Commission is considering at the moment, is the impact of the COVID crisis across the board of all EU level decision-making processes.
Okay, thank you. John, turning over to you, you lead one of the major association in Brussels, the Association of the Refinery Association, but you also a significant player and work very closely with many of the other players in the energy intensive industry. You know, this is a group of people that you talk to each other and they obviously have some common concern. In some places you agree, some places you disagree. But in general, industry has been supportive of EU's decarbonization push, but at the same time has also called for safeguard against emission leakage and competitive impacts. You know, and I think we all, most of us at least, would probably sympathize and would like to make sure that we have an industrial Europe. So what are the concerns that are being expressed in those roadmap? Are they the right concerns? Are they the right objectives? Do you think that the CBAM is a way forward? And is there anything that is missing from the EU Green Deal? Is this CBAM part and parcel of it? Is there anything else that needs to be complementary? This is all a package in some way. John.
Andre, thanks. And actually, I mean, thanks to you and to Michael for setting this up. Really good conversation. And also thanks to Jacob as well. Very good setup and covering the thinking of the Commission so far that helps us. In terms of what we think about a border carbon adjustment, it's kind of intertwined to some degree for what we think about ETS as well. And if I take the two together, ETS and a border carbon adjustment, what's our thinking? What's our relationship with those? I guess you would say, like in the Facebook status, it's complicated. I think I'd start by saying what Jake has just said about border carbon adjustment fits very well with the way we're thinking about it. It's part of a broader toolbox that is necessary for advancing a climate agenda, not only in Europe, but also across trading relationships as well. Let me just give a little bit of context about us as an industry. We as an industry make most of the fuels, about 80% of the fuels that are supplied in Europe, but also non-combusted products as well, like chemicals, feedstocks, bitumen, lubricants, etc. as well. And we are subject to a number of different types of regulation with very different carbon prices. And we're also very interested in creating markets for low carbon products of all kinds. The members that I have, I've got 40 members, every company refining petroleum in Europe, but many of them are also international companies, and also many of them are major investors in renewables. And so actually our experience in different climate and energy related policies is really substantial. And our view of ETS to start with is that it's got a lot of things that are fundamentally very good about it. It's a traded carbon market, but it only applies to European manufacture. And I think this is true for probably all of the energy intensive industries. There's plenty of capacity to supply European needs for all of the products that the energy intensive industries make outside of Europe, whether it's industries in China or India or the US or the Middle East. There's plenty of capacity to make steel, fertilizer, jet fuel, you name it, and to import it into the EU. And many of those regions I've just mentioned have got very low energy costs, very low regulatory costs, and transport around the world is amazingly cheap these days. And so the competition issue is a real issue for all of these industries. it's important to talk something about carbon prices here. We can't avoid it in these conversations. ETS has been 25 euros for a while. I think it's closer to 15 this week. And that's probably short-term effects. But at 25 euros is enough to cause some harm to the competition of an industry. It has had some very significant positive effects so far. ETS so far has been important in creating the switch from coal to gas and renewables in electricity generation, and also investments in energy efficiency across Europe. And a lot of that has been done. So a lot of the low-hanging fruit in reducing carbon intensity of European industry has been done. But going forward, we're likely to need higher carbon prices. And we think that will be difficult for a border carbon adjustment. What do we think is missing? Well, actually, I wouldn't say it's missing, but there's a lot of work to be done. The energy intensives made significant contribution in dialogue with the Commission in the run-up to the Clean Planet document that was really a landmark, and then also the Green Deal. And one of the things we've been clear about is the need to create markets for low carbon products. And we recognize, certainly in my industry, we recognize that making markets for low carbon products work will require some relatively high carbon price signals. And our ideal would be that those markets actually then start to extend across the borders of Europe into trading partners. If we make our products in a way that uses only renewable energy and renewable feedstocks, we would like also those products to be recognized and valued appropriately outside of Europe. And the quid pro quo for that, sorry for the American guys, I know there's a bit of political connotation around that. The quid pro quo would be that producers of low carbon products outside of Europe would also want then to have access to a European market that appropriately values those. That would be an ideal. But we have to face the fact that there will be trading relationships where that doesn't happen, and maybe it doesn't happen for some time. And so the way we see a border carbon adjustment is it could be a kind of a backstop, and certainly has to be part of the dialogue with different trading partners in the future. You know, if our market is open and yet we are encouraging customers to buy a lower carbon product, but the product is available from outside of Europe, made in a more carbon intensive way, there has to be some kind of protection for the investor who's invested in European production, such that there is a carbon price on the imported product. So I guess we see it as a kind of a backstop. And we're encouraged actually by the language that's in the Green Deal about creating markets for low carbon products, but we also recognize it's a huge amount of work. As industries, we're absolutely committed to collaborate to try and make that work and to develop those options. And BCA is part of the toolbox, but not the first one we go to, in our view.
Thanks, John. Talking about trading partners, Aranava, this is not the first time the EU has discussed some form or another border carbon adjustment. India, together with other emerging economies, have been very vocal on such proposals, often accusing them of being green protectionist. We don't want to get into the political reactions at this point because we're going to do that in the next panel. But can you briefly capture for us what this criticism has been about the time about green protectionism? Why did you see this as green protectionism? Again, you together with some of your colleagues in Delhi that I know well and I value their friendship. I've been part of the brain trust around the climate and energy policies of India. So I'm very keen to hear your reaction.
Can you hear me, Andre?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me on this call, and good evening, everyone. It's late in the evening for me. Let me just directly answer the issues that had come up the last time around, and try and capture, you know, where at least the India position was at that time. We're talking about a decade ago, right? At that time, Paris had not happened. The Indian position on climate negotiations and domestic policy was very different in some ways than what it is now. It was primarily about the fact that the steps that India needed to take had to be far significantly differentiated than what the historical polluters had already emitted. That India's per capita emissions would never exceed that of the global average. And against that background, there was a series of developments happening in the negotiations, which made any conversation around border carbon adjustment, whether that idea came from within the EU or when the Waxman-Markey bill was being discussed in the United States, India's reaction was similar throughout. That reaction primarily, at least in my reading, rested on 4 main themes. In the early stages, say I'm talking about 2008, 9, 10 period. The first was that any linkage to of trade and trade adjustment measures linking it to climate policy was explicitly protectionism, because the argument was that the extent of carbon leakage was not established in practice, and therefore this could not be anything other than a way to raise trade barriers and explicit protectionism. The other strand of argument was around the fact that who would actually apply some of these measures. Of course, there is jurisdictional measures that are applied by the EU as a whole, but could individual firms also start introducing various types of labelings and standards which are not governed under the WTO's technical barriers to trade agreement? And would that then have a second order impact on exports from emerging economies or developing countries like India? So unilateral measures, not just by the state, but by companies. The third was that, okay, even if we had to negotiate this, what do we get in return? And if there is a, if trade barriers rise up at one level, could trade barriers reduce at another level, where trade in environmentally friendly goods and services make it possible for us to mitigate some of the potential impacts. Now there, the assessment was that while developing countries, including India, had reasonably low applied tariffs against environmental goods and services, the kinds of products they wanted to sell had high trade barriers in the developed world. And in this case, particularly, India did not at that time had much to export, but it was still allied with what Brazil was saying in terms of bans against its ethanol exports, or China saying anti-dumping duties against its energy efficient appliances and so forth. The fourth key theme around this was that any kind of adjustment at the border also then begins to impact our access to low carbon technology. Not just because that whether we have climate friendly policies at home, but in order to implement some of those climate friendly policies, we would need access to technology. Now, if those technologies are restricted because of stringently applied or unjustly stringently applied intellectual property rights, then it's a double whammy. That on one hand, you're getting penalized for not doing enough according to your assessment, but at the same time, we are not getting access to the technologies that might allow us to leapfrog to a different trajectory. Now, these were some of the key themes that emerged. This got further complicated in the post-Copenhagen period, where in 2010, particularly leading up to Cancun and then leading up to Durban in 2011, the positions were fairly hardened, and where the basic coalition of Brazil, South Africa, India, and China was fairly tight. And therefore, there was very strong, in principle, opposition. And India kept putting forward proposals in the FCCC negotiations that any kind of suggestion of unilateral trade measures that discriminate between countries should be completely off the table. That the principle of equity contained in the FCCC convention implies that sustainable development of developing countries cannot be compromised. And that any measures taken to combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute any means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination disguised as a restriction on international trade. So these were very hardened positions that were put forward. Further on, as India's own sort of low carbon transition began with some gusto from 2010, 11, 12, as the National Action Plan on climate change started getting implemented, some of the analysis that started coming out was around if the EU went ahead and did apply, did go ahead with its plans, what would it actually mean in terms of our trade opportunities? The EU, for instance, in 2009 had put forward a list of about 164 subsectors deemed to be exposed to significant risk of carbon leakage. Now, these comprise the lion's share of India's exports to the EU. So there was a very high probability that any kind of border carbon adjustment would have a considerable impact on India's exports to the European Union. Even if the EU decided to set aside, by one assessment, about 117 highly trade intensive, but low carbon intensive sectors that were in the original list, India's vulnerability still remained pretty high. In one assessment, of the 4 basic countries after South Africa, India was considered to be the most vulnerable. The final issue, so it came around the fact that even when India started implementing its solar mission, its energy efficiency mission, and so forth, the mercantilist moves kicked in very quickly on part of its trading partners. So from 2012 itself, cases started getting listed against India at the WTO in terms of its policies on solar and the local content requirements of one part of that policy. So then you're stuck with the situation where even when you're trying to implement your National Action Plan on climate change, you're already getting constrained in terms of your options of balancing that low carbon development while trying to promote industrial development at home by the consequence of the WTO cases. So there are these kind of these conceptual, in principle, opposition in terms of trade protectionism, of standards and labeling, of access to export markets for your own products, or intellectual property rights restrictions. There were negotiation-driven, kind of alliance-based positions that India was taking on its own, but also with the basic countries. There was assessment of how it would directly impact India's export opportunities within the European Union. And finally, there was this issue of even when we act, there are cases launched against us. So I'm just summarizing what was the situation between, say, a 2009 period till about 2012-13, that the last decade and a half, which gives you a sense of where the situation was at that time. I hope that answers your question, Andre.
Yeah, well, thank you, Arunava. I will pass it on to Michael, but before I do this, I will say words that probably may make someone unhappy, but this seems to always, some of these things always seems to fall somewhere between the WTO and the UNFCCC. I had the dubious pleasure of chairing something called response measures in the UNFCCC negotiations, very long nights and very thankless nights. So many of the arguments that I heard with the Indian negotiators being less active there, by the South Africans being very, very active in this topics quite clearly. Michael, I'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you, Andre. Well, I'll take it over to this side of the Atlantic. David Banks. Dave, you're also on this side of the Atlantic in the US. And just to remind some of the audience who may have joined late, you're chief strategist for the Republican Party in the Climate Select Committee in the US House, which gives you a unique perspective on the thinking about these issues, potentially even in the White House. But before we get to the politics, Andre also mentioned earlier that we'll revisit sort of what are the likely reactions from countries. I wanted to actually harken back to the fact that, as Arunabha also hinted and mentioned briefly, many of the leading climate policy proposals in the US for over a decade have actually also contained carbon border adjustment measures, starting with the legislative push about a decade ago. The Waxman-Markey bill contained this section on international reserve allowances. But we also have it in other more recent proposals, carbon taxation bills, the Green New Deal resolution, the bipartisan proposal of the Climate Leadership Council. And in fact, California is the only jurisdiction that has actually started gathering some experience with this by imposing it on electricity imports from neighboring states. My question to you would be, does the rationale, the reasons for exploring this instrument that Jake mentioned earlier and that we also heard from the other two panelists, does that echo with the thinking that also drove these proposals in the US? And also, to the extent that you've had a sense or some insight into how the border carbon adjustment in California has worked, is there anything one can say about the experiences with this instrument?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael. Look, this is a great conversation, incredibly important, and, putting aside, the global crisis that we're facing. I mean, I still think this is something that we should spend a lot of time thinking through, talking about, because, as some of the panelists have indicated, it's a complicated issue, right? And it has consequences across the world especially if we do it the wrong way. But look, I mean, it is really interesting when you look at the conversation in the United States on border carbon adjustments, because you're right. I mean, it's been out there. People have talked about it. It's been proposed for a long time. It's still on the radar. It's reflected in the Green New Deal, as you said, and it's also reflected in most of the candidates for the presidency on the Democratic side. So I agree that the thinking is similar on this side of the Atlantic, but let's talk a little bit about kind of how it's evolved. In the United States, I would say that early support for border adjustments was largely focused on broadening out political support for unilateral emissions cuts. From Kyoto to Waxman-Markey, the most persuasive political argument pushed by U.S. opponents of carbon reductions, largely Republicans, was based on 3 points. This is going to kill the economy, U.S. jobs will simply go overseas, and global emissions will increase because overseas producers are dirtier, okay? And while there was some debate on exactly how much leakage would flow from unilateral reductions, everyone, Democrats and Republicans alike, agreed that there would be some amount of leakage. So from a political perspective, it made it an imperative to find some way or some type of mechanism that would level the playing field for domestic producers that face higher regulatory costs. The general assessment for the United States is that we couldn't pursue a politically viable GHG reduction strategy with relative deep cuts, relative to our competitors, without some type of border adjustment. Now, these concerns are still present, and they've been amplified by what I would argue is a rising economic nationalism that cuts across both major political parties, right? It's not just the Trump administration position. Again, it cuts across both parties. And the negative economic impacts of the coronavirus will only reinforce this trend. But the current policy thinking, as we've seen in California, also includes a growing recognition that the carbon loophole needs to be closed if we're going to have any hope, any chance of success in curbing global emissions. And that's why we've seen more discussion about moving away from production-based accounting to consumption-based accounting. Now, this is a tricky conversation because it cuts both ways. In the United States, for example, if we were to move toward some type of consumption-based accounting, our emissions would be at least 10% higher. Now, some people don't like that, okay? But there's an opportunity here for a new political coalition to design a climate policy that benefits domestic manufacturing. So if cleaner domestic manufacturing can displace less efficient overseas manufacturing, we could actually reduce the gap between consumption and production of emissions in a way that cuts overall US emissions, okay? Now, of course, we need to avoid the situation where a border adjustment does the opposite, that it somehow rewards less efficient domestic producers at the expense of cleaner overseas producers. This would be protectionism, you know, in the worst way that also undermines the global climate agenda. Now, as we move forward in the United States, I do see a political alignment of climate activists and economic nationalists looking for that sweet spot, you know, trying to answer the question, how do we craft an ambitious climate policy that spurs investment in domestic manufacturing and production? And how do we use a trade and climate policy that creates a competitive advantage for the United States and benefits the global climate at the same time? Back to California, you know, I'm not an expert at and sort of knowing exactly what the benefits have been. You know, I think one of our challenges when we're looking at the implications of border carbon adjustments is that we don't really have empirical evidence, right? I mean, California certainly has its limits in the type of policy that it can push forward. So that's what I mean. So given the fact that we lack that empirical evidence, we've got to be really, really thoughtful in how we move forward. You know, particularly if you have economies moving forward with unilateral action, you know, how does this impact the global system? Thank you.
Thanks, David. And fair enough, the point on California, but thanks for some excellent points. I think these are really useful, and it's encouraging to hear that there's really robust thinking going on. I think outsiders outside the US sometimes don't really perceive that, that it's a much more nuanced picture. And I think it's safe to say that this discussion will also be or play a role in any future meaningful climate policy proposals in the US. But we'll revisit the political aspect of this and how the diplomatic implications may be in a later segment. Let me maybe move to Dr. Rodolfo Lassi Tamayo. Rodolfo, you head the Environment Directorate at the OECD. And of course, we all know that the OECD has been very influential in thinking about climate policies, analyzing and conceptualizing climate policy instruments for a number of years. And I understand that you and colleagues of yours are also engaging in research on border adjustments as these now have started moving forward in the political debate. And I'm wondering, you know, I met you and I worked with you when you were still Undersecretary in Mexico. So we'll park that and really think about what is the OECD working on this? And is there any sort of particular advice or already specific insights that you think that work can yield, having heard the rationale, the reasoning for the EU to explore this, and also some of the concerns from other sides that might benefit and help in the rollout of this instrument as it moves forward?
Well, yes, Michael. Let me first say thank you for inviting us in this interesting conversation. We will see and we will hear different ideas that perhaps will help the European Commission to design this border carbon adjustment in a better way. So first we have to recognize that indirect carbon leakage is occurring massively, since environmental regulation, not necessarily related with the control of greenhouse gases, exists. So we are importing cheap fuels, clothes, foods, automobiles, electronic gadgets. And yes, we are importing these from countries with less stringent regulations and ambitious climate commitments. That's for sure. And in the products, you can find the label of, well, this is assembled or produced in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, but designed in our countries. And that is irrelevant. This is occurring at a time when extreme weather events are progressively more dangerous to the economy, and trade tensions between major economies have heightened, prompting unilateral tariff responses and contributing to a more regional rather than global approach to governing the climate trade nexus. With carbon pricing policies, carbon leakage became more sophisticated because in order to simplify the economic instruments, we are putting too much emphasis in the end of the pipeline or stack emissions and not in the embodied carbon or the carbon intensity of the goods and services we produce, trade, and provide. The interconnectedness of global production and emergence of global value chains pose additional challenges to the measurement of embedded carbon in products and in the sectorial coverage and scope of PCAs for the viable implementation. In our opinion, and this is our first advice, a circular economy approach with life cycle metrics could be more appropriate if our goal is environment, not trade. The BCAM proposal of the EU Green Deal is built conceptually in the EU ETS rules, procedures, and metrics. And those administrative tools are good and well developed to start an environmental trade war if you want it, but are not sufficient to really address the net zero emissions goals of the Paris Agreement. At the heart of this discussion, we can find a potential change in the type of measures used to prevent carbon leakage. Currently, all carbon markets are supporting domestic producers through partial exemptions to carbon prices, free allocation, fossil fuel subsidies, tax credits, you name it. And by the way, in the financial stimulus package to overcome this coronavirus crisis and possible coronavirus recession, we will see more of these things. Empirical evidence suggests that climate policies and carbon pricing mechanisms have not caused significant direct carbon leakage to date, perhaps because these policies have so far not been very ambitious, meaning carbon prices have generally been low, and where prices exist, there have been partial exemptions, as I was saying, or waivers. It's anti-analysis, which can consider more ambitious targets, predict, for example, that unilateral climate policy will result in partial carbon leakage in the range of 5 to 25%, with carbon leakage likely to occur mainly in a few specific products from trade-exposed energy-intensive industries as steel, cement, aluminium, and there are others. Therefore, ambitious climate action envisaged by some countries and economies to meet the Paris targets could lead to substantial carbon leakage and may require additional policy instruments to avoid them. To further complete this scenario, we must remember that we are negotiating in parallel Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to establish a global market of ITMOs, these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. We are in the process of creating this new market of carbon mechanism. Whether a BCA is for example, WTO compatible, well, is something that we need to discuss with WTO members and the WTO itself. But of course, in our analysis here at the OECD, we are concerned to ensure that any action is consistent with the whole spectrum of environmental international regimes. Returning to the carbon price policies, as Jane was saying, we are measuring the effective carbon rate of 42 OECD and G20 countries in the energy sector. Let me see if I can share with you some of our slides here. This is my screen. Yeah, let me see. Can you see this?
Yes, yeah, perfect.
Okay, I don't know what you are seeing.
Well, right now, I think it disappeared.
It's the end of slideshow.
Okay, let me go to the first.
There you have it.
You will see the others later. So this is the first one. this is the concept you have. No? The effective carbon rate is the sum of taxes and tradable permits that put a price on carbon emissions. We also estimate the carbon price gap, measuring the difference between a benchmark value and the actual carbon price for every percentile of emissions, summing all positive differences and expresses it as a percentage. If the carbon price on all emissions were at least as high as the benchmark that you are seeing in the screen, the gap will be 0. And if the price were 0 throughout, well, the gap will be 100%. So two benchmark values are applied in our analysis. And you are seeing here that 30 euros per ton of CO2. That is the low end estimate. This is a fair question, no? Because we are trying to reflect here the externalities, the cost of the externalities of these emissions. And it's a question that we need to address. So let me show the next slide. But we can see here in this slide that the energy sector, for example, can be compared in all these countries using the carbon pricing gap and the carbon intensity of GDP. I will not take too much time on this because you can download the documents that I showed the front page of the documents or the cover. And what are our, for example, some of the takeaways of this exercise that we are doing? First, that you can see here in the transportation sector that the carbon price signals are stronger in road transport, but not, for example, in international aviation and maritime transportation. So from the 85% of energy-related CO2 emissions, only 18% is covered by taxes. And we are using planes to provide tourism services and ships to do all the trade activities in our countries. So we find out that in countries with a combustion sources, well, energy use tends to be less carbon intensive, as you can see here in this slide. So thank you for seeing these slides. Let me go back to the main screen here, just to be sure that I am not sharing the screen. Did I?
Still sharing?
Stop share. Okay. Perfect.
There we go.
Yes, as you certainly know, emissions trading systems can be as effective and efficient as carbon taxes. So ETS, analyzed in the OECD effective carbon rates report, account for approximately 6% of carbon price signals in OECD and G20 countries. The extent to which countries choose the price carbon emissions through taxes or ETS varies substantially across all these countries. So BCAs are controversial, and the potential effects and implications of any such measures will likely be highly criticized, scrutinized, and legally debated if it is implemented. And the way we will see this discussion is the way we measure the carbon intensity of the carbon content. So water carbon adjustments may be a good idea in principle, but in practice, they raise a number of technical and political challenges. A common understanding of the issue and implications of proposed solutions and coordinated action is the most, in my opinion, effective way to stem carbon emissions. So the OECD will continue to work to help inform governments thinking on a common understanding of the climate change issue and the kind of urgent actions needed to address it. So thank you very much for having us today.
Excellent, thank you, Rodolfo. And obviously, it'll be extremely important, I think, to have an objective and analysis-driven approach to trying to gauge what other countries are doing. That's certainly one of the most sensitive and tricky elements of any border carbon adjustment, if one wants to take into account, and some say it's necessary for WTO compliance, what other countries already have in place in terms of carbon policies. Let me shift our last, but certainly not least panelist, Geneviève Pons. You lead a Brussels-based think tank, the Europe Jacques Delors think tank. And as many of us who joined a recent OECD roundtable know, you, working with Pascal Lamy and others, are conceptualizing a proposal on how to implement a BCA and design one. And I'd be curious, if you could share maybe some of the main takeaways from that ongoing work and how it might affect or be useful to what the European Union is currently doing. Geneviève. Geneviève, you were just unmuted, but there you are. Very good. Excellent.
I'm sorry. So I was unmuted before talking, which is a bit strange. Yes, I will tell you a bit of a personal story because first of all, the cooperation with Pascal Lamy is not new at all. I was already in the cabinet of Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, in the 90s. And I was with him in Rio. Our head of cabinet was Pascal Lamy. I was in charge of environment. I was the one who fought for the CO2 taxation in the cabinet of Jacques Delors. We were successful in the Commission, but we were not successful in the Council. And this CO2 taxation proposal was never adopted by the Council. And that's why one day, the guy with whom I had fought for the CO2 taxation, Jos Delbecq, invented with others the famous ETS. ETS was born with a lot of weaknesses, but when I was heading WWF European office, we were part of the ones who fought for a big reform of the EU ETS with a certain success. And as you have mentioned, EU ETS has reached 25 euros before plunging with the COVID-19 crisis. So it's an old story of cooperation. I want to say also something else. The discussion about BCAs has long been a very theoretical one. It cannot no longer be a theoretical one, as the von der Leyen Commission has very clearly announced that EU BCA proposal will be presented. When she announced that, we had already decided with Pascal Lamy, who, as you know, is a former head of WTO, and with the help of Pierre Le Turc, to write about the trade and environment nexus. And we had already published 2 papers about that. The first one trying to draw a broad picture of what can be done to green trade policy. So this was not new to us. And we have put together our experiences, his big knowledge of trade policy, my knowledge of environment policy, to reflect on BCAs. And some very simple declaration before going maybe into more details. We are facing an emergency. We are facing a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency, environment emergency. We are all conscious of that. And in order to deal with this emergency, we need a significant carbon price. If we want to reach the objective which has been set in Paris, we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. We know that to be carbon neutral by 2050, we need a significant carbon price signal. If we don't have it, we will not reach this objective. What does it mean, a significant carbon price? It means that for certain intensive industries, if they are alone in the EU to face this carbon price, the result will inevitably be carbon leakage. If we look at EU emissions, we all know here that we should not measure them through the production. We should measure them through the consumption. And if we measure them through the consumption, we know that they have not been so radically reduced since 1990. The imported emissions represent 30% of our produced emissions. So it is a problem that is already present and that would be inevitably aggravated if we adopt a significant CO2 price. That's why we must look very seriously, despite all the technical, legal, etc. obstacles, we have to look very seriously at this possibility of adopting a border carbon adjustment mechanism. And this is exactly what we did with Pascal's experience, with my own experience, with his knowledge of the WTO jurisprudence, and with my own experience of ETS. And now maybe Damien, who has my presentation, can show the second slide. And with this second slide, you will discover the main features of what we propose. We propose to use the EU ETS system. Why? Because the EU ETS system has the merit of existing, because it is targeting the most intensive industries, and because it gives for these industries a certain expertise, a certain knowledge of the intensity of the carbon intensity of the different products. So we want to use the ETS experience. Why a parallel system aligned with EU ETS? It's a rather complicated sentence just to say that we will use it, but in order to not disturb the balance inside the ETS market, we will align the price at the border. That is what we propose. We will align the price at the border to the price of the same product in the EU the day before. That's what it means. We propose also to proceed in a progressive manner. And we propose to proceed with pilot products. One which is very often proposed as a pilot, which is cement, for many reasons, because it travels a bit less than as a product, because it's a very heavy product, and it's a bit easier to characterize the different types of cement and so on. But in an interesting manner, after having participated in this roundtable on sustainable development in the OECD, we decided also to integrate electricity. And why? Because people who were there and who were representing the electricity industry explained to us something which we had already heard. It is that in this sector, carbon leakage is already there. It is already happening. So I think it is really interesting for us to consider a sector where the producers in Europe already pay for their allowances and already experience carbon leakage. I do not enter into detail now, but I could. Now, no, please come back to the preceding slides. Now, for the nature and use of the levy, what I want to say, it's not a tax. It should not be a tax. Why? Because first of all, the ETS with which it is aligned, and with which it must be aligned if we don't want to be discriminatory and if we want to be in accordance with WTO rules, the ETS is not a tax. That's the first point. Second, and it goes together, because to adopt a tax in the EU, one needs unanimity, and we know that we will never get unanimity. So it is not a tax. I think we can call it a levy, and anyway, what is important is to know that it will be aligned with the ETS. So if we are able to qualify the ETS, we are able to qualify this levy. About the use of the levy, one of the uses of the levy will be to finance an independent agency that will be able to deal with the request of importers if they consider that the price that they are supposed to pay is not fair. So that's one of the uses of the levy. Another user that we considered is encouragement of technology advances, but not only inside the EU, of course, once again, not to be discriminatory, but also in importing in countries from which we import, and especially the least advanced ones. Once again, to be in accordance with WTO rules, we have to phase out free allowances at the same rhythm as we introduce a BCA. So it has to be totally aligned in order to avoid to be considered as discriminatory. And finally, what I would like to underline is that we will use a 2-year test period, not only to adjust technically the mechanism, but also, of course, and maybe, well, of course, to negotiate with our main trading partners in order to ensure that our approach is cooperative, collaborative, and not conflictual at all. Many of our trading partners have already systems similar to the EU ETS. We have spoken of California, and we could have spoken of China. In the case of China, we know that it is aligned with our ETS, as we have played a role in shaping the Chinese system. So we have there are many ETS around the world, and the approach that we could follow is a kind of carbon club approach. So going to the other, to the trading partners who have ETS or similar system, pricing, a CO2 pricing system, and see with them how we can progress together. So that will be the main aim of this 2 years period. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Geneviève. That was excellent. I think it also illustrated some issues that we may have, you know, Jake described many of these, but it was quick. And I think having it on the slides was a good reminder. And with that, I think we've got an excellent sort of starting point for the probably a bit more dynamic segment of this webinar on the political reactions. And I hand back to Andre in Brussels.
Well, look, my former boss, Maurice Strong, told me once that I'm halfway past my life and I have not achieved half of the things I've done. I think that we're halfway through the seminar. We have not achieved one of the important, if you want, objectives. I'd like a dynamic discussion, and I'd like the participants to be able to ask that question and put you guys on the spot. Now, experience on border carbon, there's not that many. There is the aviation, international aviation in the EU ETS that led to the stop the clock in the EU, and with ICAO stepping in and Corsia now with some mixed participation, at least the way I see it. We see a border adjustment of some sort, but it's internal, as you said, David, in California. Interstate commerce somehow got managed to get around that. Jake, you talked about domestically that you have the European Green Deal that has changed the world, or the world in which we think, and that you and I and many others in Brussels live in. Internationally, what makes you think that things have changed from when EU ETS tried to incorporate international aviation?
Well, I mean, the main thing that has changed is, of course, is the Paris Agreement, as other panelists have mentioned, which has this combination of very, very bold and ambitious goals, and most notably achieving net zero emissions in the second half of the century, in line with avoiding those dangerous global average temperature rise, but then combined with a very nationally determined approach in terms of how each country will address those challenges of meeting those goals. So that's the main thing that has changed, a combination of a great deal of global collective ambition, but still a strong inference that it's up to each country to set the pace and the pathway by which it will contribute to that. The specific global development that you referred to, which is the putting in place of a system to manage emissions within the civil aviation sector through a cap on emissions growth from this year onwards, and the use of an offsetting system to help to achieve that cap is another development that's happened that I think is in part been driven by the same politics that drove the Paris Agreement. In terms of how that either of those might affect the way in which we are revising the ETS, and particularly its application to aviation, that's another piece of policy that is under development at the moment. So the ETS is core part of what we need to adjust in order to achieve the increased ambition of the European Green Deal. And we are in the process of preparing the proposals that will be presented in 2021 for adoption as legislation. Part of that is figuring out how do we incorporate the developments in ICAO and CORSIA into that adjusted ETS. We've already made some progress in part of that, in the sense that we've put in place the measuring, reporting, and verification systems within the EU that will allow us to track emissions from our airlines in a way that is necessary for CORSIA to operate effectively. The other adjustments are still very much under consideration. CORSIA, as you know, Andre, has just been approved by the Council for the way in which the pilot phase of CORSIA will operate, which includes the approval of certain sources of offsets as being legitimate under the CORSIA system, and also includes a vintage year that will allow the carryover from pre-2020 emissions reductions to the post-2020 scheme. So that's how the global developments are currently interacting with the redesign of the ETS as applies to aviation. I don't think the analogy between the ETS as it applies to aviation and border carbon adjustment mechanism is all that direct or clear, other than both have proved to be very controversial because of, I think, of what Arunaba referred to as the potential extraterritorial effect of the legislation, both of which, both a border carbon adjustment mechanism and the ETS as applied to international aviation, reaches beyond European borders, physical borders, to deal with emissions that are taking place outside of those borders. So for those reasons, it's politically controversial. But other than that, I don't see a direct analogy between the two systems or the two policy instruments.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Jake. David, turning to you, the president has announced that the U.S. is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, has made trade a signature and jobs a signature of his presidency, and he is very insistent he's going into an election year. So this is an important moment. What kind of reaction can we expect from the administration and the Congress? Yeah, we're beginning to see some of that, but you're kind of right there, and you hear a lot of things that we get echoes of.
Good question. First of all, it's fun following Jake here. It's been a while.
Well, at least we did something. We made something possible.
But look, this is a crystal ball question, and you know, when you're talking about aviation, it does offer an interesting example, you know, of how the U.S. could react. But let's return to that. Let's return to that a bit. So, if we're looking at the time frame for EU policy implementation, I'm assuming that we're looking past November, the November election. We're looking in the next year, right? Right, Jake? Yeah. So, so let's start from that. And just a reminder, I'm not speaking on behalf of the administration or the Congress. This is just, you know, Dave Banks putting on his independent analyst hat. So let's look at a couple of different scenarios: Trump reelection and a Democrat taking the White House. Right now, it's way too early to forecast the results of the election in November. You know, in my opinion, I think it probably comes down to how the public views the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus at the time of the election. Not now, but at the time of the election. If those numbers look good, he's probably reelected. If not, you know, we may have Joe Biden, who's highly likely to push for some type of a border adjustment. And I'm saying that just because it's reflected in his policy platform, and he's also brought it up during the debates, which I found really interesting. So the Trump administration, and I think this is important to sort of to recognize up front, at least the political class within the administration, not the bureaucracy, but those folks are not tracking closely what's happening with this conversation in Europe. Okay, now this doesn't really surprise me as someone who worked at the U.S. mission to the EU during the early stages of that aviation conversation in Brussels. And for the life of me, I could not get Washington to listen and sort of engage the EU up front on aviation. And so I think, based on my experience, you know, Washington doesn't tend to address policy differences with the EU early in any kind of bureaucratic process. And unfortunately, the U.S. usually waits until the issue moves up further up into the process, you know, which often poses substantial political challenges because already there's been a lot of political capital invested in sort of formulating the policy in Europe. So if it's President Trump in a second term for the president, you know, I see the administration being caught off guard, you know, and then I think the reaction is they flip out. Okay, they threaten to retaliate, and they probably would do so, but you know, not because of some ideological reason against climate action, but because they don't understand that EU and US interests could actually align nicely given the general direction of decarbonization of our economies, and because our industry, European American, you might broaden out to OECD, but it's generally cleaner from a GHG perspective than many of our overseas competitors. But a second term Trump administration, its reaction is also going to depend on staffing. You know, it's possible that you could have, you know, a different team, a team that could pitch a trade and climate policy to the president that he could actually support. And it's possible that a new team could push for greater cooperation with our allies, helping reset the relationship. As you said, you know, the president cares a lot about manufacturing and trade, not so much about climate as everyone on this video conference recognizes. He views climate action through the lens of, you know, what does this do to U.S. competitiveness? That's why he opposed the Paris Agreement, putting aside the obvious option that the U.S. could have changed the previous administration's pledge. But if he were pitched the idea that the United States could create a climate policy that would put China at a competitive disadvantage, I think he would be interested. But again, this all depends on staffing. Someone's got to do that work, and there's no one there at this moment who probably would take the lead in that. So right now, we should expect the second term Trump presidency to retaliate. If it's Joe Biden, I would anticipate his team reaching out to the EU during the transition, that's between the election and inauguration, to discuss a common approach to trade and climate policy, as well as a lot of other issues. But I think, even, Biden's team would almost, I think, certainly oppose unilateral action. And I think that's because they would create political difficulties for any new Democratic administration with the Congress, with key constituents, labor unions, whoever. And I think that's an important point, and going back to the aviation conversation, because that was, I think there you saw bipartisan opposition to sort of, what people argue was unilateral EU action within the aviation sector. Congress.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Congress, particularly if Republicans control any of the two chambers, would oppose unilateral action. I would expect bills, resolutions, whatever, designed to thwart it, and I assume bipartisan support for opposing it. And again, even if Democrats hold the House of Representatives and take the U.S. Senate. Having said that, wrapping it up, I do think there are significant opportunities for cooperation that I believe we'll get to later.
Yeah, I think, David, you said a very important word, unilateral action, because I think that any kind of measure of this kind done unilaterally may be very, very different from something that's being seen as cooperative. And probably that's where the trick is. Listen, let's accelerate, because we really would like to give our speakers and our participants the chance to ask some questions. Arunaba, CVDR, China has already made noises, quite strong noises, that this ain't gonna sit very well with the People's Republic of China. What kind of reaction, looking the crystal ball, can we expect from the Indian government?
Andre, I'm conscious that you want to get your
No, we're anxious to listen to you.
I'm going to try and keep this quick. Let's look at two different scenarios. One is simply a repeat of the same arguments I made earlier. Okay, I'm not a negotiator, so we can just speculate that the same arguments, at least in principle, that was stated a decade earlier, might be restated, and that would be the reaction. But let me look at a slightly different chain scenario. The chain scenario, as Jake was also highlighting, is that we've had Paris, is that we've had a Kigali amendment to the Montreal Protocol and HFC phase down. We have had the ICAO agreement, and India has come forward and created the International Solar Alliance. So India has participated very actively in a season of climate agreements as an active, not just an active participant, but a contributor towards getting to a deal. Under that context, or against that context, what kind of reactions might you still get? I think that you will get a mix, or you could get a mix of the pushback versus maybe some openings. Let me just articulate that in sort of 5 different ways. Number one, the agenda setting. Will this even be permitted to be discussed as an issue? Of course, the EU can go ahead and be unilateral about it, but the in-principle opposition will remain. But more than that will be the issue that under current actions, the calculations suggest that even up to 2030, the EU, US, China, and Japan are going to take up 49% of the available carbon space. So what really is the basis on which any kind of argument is being made about further action? Against that, we also are going to have a major global economic downswing during and after the coronavirus pandemic. But there is a twist, and there's a twist because a lot of my recent writing has been on this, is that despite a severe economic kind of constraint, that India is facing, can the green economy save the economy in itself? And that's not just about greening one part of the economy, but can green economic sectors itself, which are low carbon, more sustainable, etc., also be drivers of new economic growth? And there are pockets of that consideration that are going on. So that might be one type of nuance that comes forward. Number two, if this were to be negotiated in any forum, let's take a pick, then India's argument would be, well, look at our record. We are the only major economy that is currently on track to meet its NDC goals. Now, you could say this is not good enough, but nor is every other goal good enough. Paris was a basis on which everyone comes forward and then says, this is what we can do. Against what we've said we can do, we're the only major economy on track to meet those goals. If you want ambition, then the question would be, how are we evaluating ambition? Are we front-loading commitments up to 2030 rather than looking at what would be the eventual outcome by 2050? And how will we look at what has been unmet commitments between 2012 and 2020? Right? Moreover, there will be this notion that post-Paris, there has been a greater de-hyphenation between India and China. So if that differentiation is not just between the developed countries and developing countries, but also within categories of developing countries, as was the case with the Montreal Protocol Agreement, then maybe there'll be room for maneuver, because then a differentiated India from China, you can go ahead and apply rules against China, but India will still argue that it should not be targeted. The third element will be what happens in the implementation phase. And again, this is where what do we get in return comes in. And I think some of the points that have come up in the past will become relevant again. Mercantilism is already evident in the clean energy, clean tech sectors. My own calculations show that between 2009 and 15, between Copenhagen and Paris, 11% of new WTO disputes were related to clean energy and related technologies. Now, these technologies and these products don't account for 11% of global trade. So what was happening is major economies were planting a mercantilist flag in emerging budding sectors. Now, where is the room for maneuver there? As Genevieve was positing, industrial decarbonization is still the major space where we haven't yet locked in terms of nationalistic approach to technologies. And if there were a way of negotiating the development, deployment, piloting, and scaling up of industrial decarbonization technologies where India could participate, maybe there's room for maneuver. The fourth element will be measurement challenges, and the challenges of methodologies, etc., that have already been raised will remain. So until we have clarity on that, there will remain some opposition. Finally, this issue of enforcement. If we have to only rely on how the EU will judge your actions, where is the recourse for other countries? With the breakdown, not just the kind of debilitation of the WTO, but more specifically, sort of the end of the appellate body, then there is no recourse. So there is no provision for justice either. So whether it's agenda setting, negotiations, implementation, monitoring, and measurement, or enforcement, there's going to be opposition, but there is potential room for maneuver if you can find resolution to them. My final point is that within India at CEW, we've been convening a group of industries, think tanks, former policymakers, etc., on what we call a working group on mitigation instruments, where we've evaluated the conditions under which whether we should have a countrywide emissions trading scheme or a countrywide carbon taxation scheme. There are sectoral carbon taxes, but not countrywide. How we should look at the Article 6 arrangement, or whether we should even look at company level initiatives. So I just want to posit that there is a growing and maturing conversation about the best ways forward, not just for India to reduce its own emissions, but how India can engage with the evolving market and policy regulatory structure outside.
I'd love to follow up with a few questions, and Rabah, I'm sure there'll be other opportunities, but I think that we need to move on, and I apologize for that. Rodolfo, not as OECD, but you have an OECD hat. but we're addressing you now as a former Mexican official. Mexican economy is very dependent on trade, and trade with the U.S. among others, a very important element. There was a brief conversation at some point about border adjustment for cement between California and Mexico. I was part of some of those discussions, and I mean, I've kind of asked some people whether the State Department was involved in that conversation. They seemed not to be involved at that time. But what is the thinking? Is this a topic of, as they say in Mexico, God is far away, but the United States is close. So is there any discussion about the US, EU border kind of adjustment? Is there any discussion about that?
Well, yes, because as you are saying, we are trading avocados, for example. We are trading cars. We are trading a lot of things with Europe, but also with United States and North America. That's why we include in the new U.S. and Mexico-Canada agreement chapter on environmental issues. At that time, when we were discussing these border carbon adjustments for the cement industry, it was part of the Climate Action Reserve in California. And you have to take into account that the Mexican cement industry is more or less insulated from these border tariffs of border situation, because they have plants in both sides of the border, and we are selling cement in United States and Canada. And the situation of the Mexican industry is very peculiar in this border region. The cement industries in the ETS, the cap and trade system in California is receiving a 50% of the tradable permits as free allowances. And that is an advantage to, of course, avoid the carbon leakage, because the sector is high risk of leakage. We were discussing, if I remember well, 3 different options, and this is important for the future design of this VCA. One is to, of course, impose all the requirements of the carbon and the cap and trade system to importers. And this is, well, something very tough to accept if you are in the other side of the border. The other option was to have linked cost. That means that you have to take into account the emission obligation of the sector, plus the price of the allowance. And if you want to, of course, export cement, you have to pay that cost. There was another option to create some kind of a mini cap and trade system just for the importers, if they are not having plants in California, and creating, of course, also a purchase and sales system very similar to the one we were in charge in the Climate Action Reserve. There are 2 entities doing this. But, well, California is now going beyond that idea from the government side, and because this discussion didn't fly at the end. Now, and this is, in my opinion, very relevant, the Governor Brown in 2017 passed this bill to establish the Buy Clean California Act. And in the act, they are requiring a maximum acceptable life cycle global potential for building materials, including steel and cement. So this is in my opinion the things that we have to have in our countries. So this act is applicable to imported materials to reduce avoided emissions. And since July 1st, last year, companies bidding for projects with the state of California are submitting robust LCA of materials used in the projects to ensure that they meet the new standards. And in the case of California, let me see, there is a benchmark, and this benchmark is quite stringent. But of course, this is something that is only happening in California because California is a very peculiar state in the US. The other important thing that, in my opinion, is relevant in California is this low carbon fuel standard. And Mexican companies are exporting fuels to California, and they designed a system based in a very stringent regulation to accept different fuels based in, again, in a life cycle assessment that was established using the model of one of the national laboratories in the US, the Argonne. So the program is based in measuring CO2, methane, of course, all these greenhouse gases and other F gases that are relevant for the transportation sector as the air-conditioned refrigerants. So this is important because they have also a credit mechanism. And they are creating, of course, a market of new fuels, and they are improving the fuel pool of the state with this kind of regulation that in fact are like border requirements. It's in my opinion something that must be considered, as I was saying, in the design of the BCAN.
Thank you, Rodolfo. I'll pass it on to Michael and see how Michael can keep people on track.
All right, thank you, Andre. Well, so we're conscious of time, but we did feel when we were thinking about the narrative here that we would like to end on a positive note. And I think in the last segment, several remarks, highlighted that there's a lot of issues, lots of sensitivities, but also hinted that there was ways of moving forward on a more cooperative note. And I'd like to pick up on that particular element. Geneviève, in your remarks earlier, you mentioned that the process of rolling out the BCA is extremely important, and I think everybody who's been following this topic fully concurs. The way it is done is probably as important as what is being done, how partners are engaged, and how the dialogue is, how transparent, how inclusive it is, etc. In your proposal, if we can keep this the next few remarks rather short, so we can move to Q&A still. But in your proposal, how were you envisioning to do that, to ensure that it is open, inclusive, etc., in order to minimize such diplomatic pushback and fallout?
Thank you very much, Michael. I will be able to be short because we will have a new occasion to discuss this proposal. If everything goes well, which I am praying for, we will have a conference organized on the 14th of May here in Brussels in Town Hall, Europe. Will still Pascal Lamy, Paolo Gentiloni, Pascal Canfin, Sabine Veillant. So we should really have the occasion to enter into details. Yes, we have to be cooperative. I think it is absolutely essential because it is a problem for the whole planet. It is not an EU problem. And what is the aim? The aim is to reduce the CO2 emission globally. It would have absolutely no effect if we try to reduce them only in Europe. It has to be a global endeavor. And it would not be realistic. It would be absolutely stupid to try to progress against anybody. It is obvious. We need the US to be in. We need India to be in. We need China to be in. If not, forget it. It will not work. So I think that once anybody has understood, first of all, that if we want to keep our planet, we need to act very rapidly. To act very rapidly, we need a significant carbon price. Then we should be able to progress together. And the BCA could be the start of this process. The dream would be a global CO2 price. That is the dream. If the dream is out of reach, then we have to progress toward the dream. And to progress toward the dream, let's start with what we have. We have the EU ETS, and we have a promise of a BCA, and then go to our partners and see with them how we can progress together.
Geneviève, that's a clarion call to reach towards the optimal, which I think we all agree would be, a converging climate policy around the globe and not unilateral approaches. But John, let me turn to you. I mean, there is, of course, still this lingering possibility that the political and diplomatic reactions as this proposal proceeds in the EU show that it is a political non-starter. I know Jake said that he doesn't think the parallel of international aviation and the EU ETS is necessarily a valid comparison, but let's assume a worst case scenario. And obviously the deterioration of relations that would fall is also something the private sector would definitely want to avoid. What could be a plan B? Is there, in your view, some way that sectors such as refinery sector and other industry sectors could work together to launch something that's not driven by a country, but globally by a whole industry sector? Or do you see some other alternatives that might work to fill the vacuum should this border carbon adjustment not do what Geneviève optimistically portrayed as sort of the incentive, the stimulus to get global cooperation on climate policy, which is really what we want?
Michael, thank you. It's a very important question because our industry, along with most energy intensive industries, actually are international industries. If you look at the manufacturers in Europe, many of the companies are headquartered around the world. And if a border carbon adjustment proposal is advanced that is seen as being punitive, then it puts those industries in a very difficult position in terms of the government relationships they have around the world. And so we think it's in everybody's interests to have a policy that's seen as progressive and an opportunity for many countries, not only Europe, to participate. And so we've given this a lot of thought, and we've got some observations and then an idea that comes out of our own industry construct that we'd like others to look at and consider whether it's got some basis for copying. I've got one slide that I've shared with Damun. Is it possible that you could get that on the screen for me? Thank you. So here you have a picture, an overview of what's happening in the fuels industry in Europe today. On the left-hand side, you have a refinery producing fuels and emitting CO2 in the process at the moment. And that CO2 emission is in the scope, of course, of the ETS. That's the point of obligation of the ETS regulation and currently subject to a €25 price. And of course, we buy allowances for those not covered by free allowances. The Commission recognizes the carbon leakage risk and grants some free allowances to industry to try and maintain a level playing field. But this isn't the only CO2 regulation that this industry is subject to. If you follow that blue line across the screen, you'll see the road transport fuels then move to a distribution point that we also call a duty point. A distribution point is essentially a collection of tanks surrounded by a high wire fence. The inputs of fuel to these tanks for storage and the outputs are metered with very, very good infrastructure, very accurate meters. And one of the reasons that they're very well managed like that is because this is the point that the fuel is subject to taxation and governments want to make sure that there is no cheating whatsoever on taxation, and the infrastructure is really good. You'll see imported fuels come into that collection point, that for distribution point, and all fuels that make it to the road transport market go through one of these points somewhere in Europe. There's maybe 100 or 2 across all of Europe, not a lot. And as I say, they're subject to a lot of administration. Another interesting thing happens at this duty point or distribution point, and that is another regulation intended to reduce the carbon emissions of the use of our products also applies. The Renewable Energy Directive. It's the point of obligation there. The red, as we call it, is what causes us to purchase biofuels and to blend those, and they have an implied carbon price of around between 200 and 470 euros a ton of carbon, far higher than the ETS price. The 470 actually comes from the penalty price of the German version. 200 is kind of a typical value in many of the, for much of the value of the products. But it's important for us to stop a moment and say, of the different regulations on this slide here, which is it that causes a competition concern for our industry and similarly for other industries? Is it the 25 euro or the 200 to 470 euro? It's the 25 euro because it's applied to manufacturing and not to the imports. We already have this Renewable Energy Directive obligation. It's been going for 10 years and there are no free allowances, and it does not cause a competition problem between imported and domestic production. And so it's our view that this regulation is more likely to be the right way to evolve regulation for our industry to enable us to do more. Because we do want to do a lot more in terms of reducing the emissions of our industry and the use of the products. And we think this regulation, because it is closer to the customer and because it applies to imported as well as domestic, is the right way to go forward. And we wonder whether other industries could also go down this route of having a collection point where there is a tariff or there is a regulation at point of entry to the market, not crossing the border. So it's a market entry tariff or a market entry obligation rather than a border obligation. And we think that would be more politically acceptable. But of course, it would also make the opportunity to supply low carbon products into the European market available and potentially interesting to importers as well. I'll stop there if there's any questions or responses to that.
Great, great, John, thanks. And I'm sure that, you know, some features here might be specific to particular industries, but I think what's very important is just simply to remember there are potentially other ways of dealing with carbon leakage and the challenges that the border adjustment is meant to tackle. And we, as well as many others, are still thinking about those. And I think it's important to keep those discussions and that thinking going as we continue to operationalize the CBAM proposal. Let me finish maybe in this sort of moderated part before we open to Q&A, at which point I'll give it back to Andre. One final question to you, Dave. You mentioned something which I think would be very helpful. Andre said it, you know, if the US were to cooperate or itself engage on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, that would be a total game changer. Needless to say, the two largest markets in the world and import markets. You hinted potentially at how that could go. Do you have any additional thoughts? What might the potential be for such transatlantic cooperation? How could it actually look going forward? And hopefully with a more positive note, we then conclude this webinar.
Yeah, thanks. And by the way, I might even suggest it be a potential OECD approach, at least initially, right? Because I think that we actually have an opportunity to construct a plurilateral approach to addressing, you know, some of these challenges that we're talking about. But look, personally, I'm a strong believer in the transatlantic alliance, and I just want to say this because I know it's hanging out there. I know that there are a lot of Europeans frustrated, disappointed, upset with the Trump administration and the relationship with the United States, whether we're talking about climate or trade or other issues. Again, I can't speak for the administration or for the Congress, but I think the current situation is an outlier. not because I want it to be an outlier, but because I don't think we have any other choice. It's not just a common history that we share, it's also a common future. Our role, the EU and the US in the global economy, as we all know, is becoming smaller. Our influence is becoming less. Within a decade or two, our ability to shape the global system may be almost non-existent, especially as the influence of state-owned enterprises, particularly those in China, expand significantly. So if we don't work together now, I think we're going to face a more dangerous world, and our destinies are intertwined. But, as I said earlier, a democratic administration would almost certainly include border adjustments in its climate policy making. The question is, if there's a timing issue, of course, and that the EU is a lot further ahead than the US would be. But again, I think there's a good opportunity for cooperation. I would argue that the EU should work with the new administration to develop a bilateral or plurilateral approach and to avoid unilateral action if possible. If the president's reelected, folks are going to have to be more creative, okay, in their engagement with the United States. I mean, that's just the truth. And that might take a lot of patience that currently doesn't exist. Again, for some of the reasons we just flagged. Now, you staffing the White House could help, but I would also recommend that the EU policymakers, stakeholders, reach out to different thought leaders in the United States, whether it's state-based or in DC, but also to congressional Republicans who are in the process of developing a climate change strategy and who might recognize that this type of thinking could help level the playing field, in trade, particularly with China. Now, while congressional Republicans are not there yet, I think that's an important point. They could potentially prove to be helpful in developing a common EU-US approach that could also work for a second-term Trump administration. Again, I do think that there's a potential alignment here in a sweet spot that brings together economic nationalists and climate activists. I think they could find common ground. In my opinion, again, I'm not speaking formally here, but I believe there is an opportunity for the United States to work closely with our allies in Europe and elsewhere to design a policy that helps us maintain, our influence. And when I say our influence, I'm also talking about the influence of our private industry, the private sector, in shaping the global economic system and reduce global emissions at the same time. Now, I found John's points interesting. I do want to take a moment to say that personally, I believe that a plurilateral sectoral approach, again, looking at a potential OECD or some subgroup of the OECD play, I think that might be worthwhile exploring before we sort of put together, any kind of, at least formally and officially, a traditional border carbon adjustment. Now, maybe that can happen at the same time, right? As people are kind of working through what a typical border carbon adjustment looks like. But we should be creating a market sector by sector that accelerates clean energy innovation and a race to the top. And we also need to create a system that's open to the developing world or economies that don't have a national price on carbon, right? We need to be pushing transparency. And again, that's one of the reasons why the Trump administration continued to participate constructively in the UNFCCC to make sure we got the best rule book possible. Again, transparency, emissions, inventories, accounting, et cetera. But if the cleanest producer in the world of any given product is headquartered in the developing economy, for example, why would that company face a carbon adjustment or a tariff? I mean, we could have an entirely separate conversation on all of this, alternatives to a conventional approach. But finally, as a silver lining to the crisis that we're facing, I do think it's going to push us closer together in the end. We need one another more than ever to face, global challenges.
Thanks. Thanks, David. And I'm being left to the long and the short of 5 minutes of Q&A, which was supposed to be the highlight of this whole thing. Now, the one thing I'll say is I'll start with Daniel Stenson from the Swedish EPA, because he's got, by the way, there's an opportunity to raise your arm. There's a virtual arm that you raise and we can see it, and then we'll give you the floor. So, Domin, do you want to give the floor to Daniel?
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Daniel. Speak up.
Great. So thanks a lot for a really interesting discussion. I've got one quite quick question, and that relates how to decide if this is to be implemented, how to decide which countries the levies are to be imposed upon. Are we looking at prices? Are we looking at what policies the other country is imposing? Are we looking towards ambition as in targets, and also what does that then mean for the every country now has an NDC that should reflect the highest possible ambition. So I'm thinking, what criteria would one should use when deciding to impose the levy? Thank you.
Okay, Claire Tournuy also from France. Claire?
Sorry, I was muted. It should be okay.
We can hear you now, Claire. Go ahead.
Okay, super. Thank you very much, Andre. Congratulations for this extremely interesting seminar. I would like to widen a little bit the question and to suggest a slightly different approach, close to what John has shown, but not only sectorial. To say that in the Green Deal there are 2 points for changing ETS. One is a border mechanism. The other one is the extension of the ETS to other sectors. And if you join the two, it is actually a different approach to CO2 emission regulations that is appearing, which is a carbon footprint of Europe being reduced, not only the territorial emissions. And this, if you take the approach that what we are actually trying to reduce is the carbon footprint of Europe, then it includes both the emissions on the European land, but also emissions imported, associated to imported products. And then you have the same thing as an extended ETS plus a border mechanism, except that it is only one approach. You have all emissions emitted for European consumption subjected to the same system of market of allowances. And you take the approach of John to say what is important is the market entry, is the entry point on the market, and you measure emissions not only of fuels for cars, but of all products. And then that could be a different approach, this carbon footprint regulation and decrease that could be avoiding a lot of diplomatic trouble.
Let's leave it. Let's keep it short. Who wants to react to these first two questions? And I'm also many of them are addressed probably to ETS type of questions the way I hear them. But there was another one, broader one from the Swedish EPA. Rodolfo, you had your hand up.
Well, these questions are very interesting, of course, because there are concerns from countries like Mexico or African and Asian countries on how Europe will implement these measures. They will be stringent as other countries are for other products or goods. We have to take into account that there are many environmental international regimes that impose specific bans and specific measures to avoid toxic substances in the products that we are importing. And there are a huge amount of these standards that our companies must comply. So the idea that we are proposing is to start with key energy intensive sectors instead of focusing in countries or having a whole imported products policy for VCAs. So in a gradually implementation approach, I think it's better to start with those sectors that are hard to control in the climate problem and are, of course, the main emitters in this situation.
Jake, any reaction from you on Renewable? Maybe the first question. Any reaction from you folks? Don't necessarily. I'm not pointing fingers.
No, I mean, I could react quickly. I mean, I think just hearing the different panelists, all of whom have been very, very interesting, you can see that the policy objective that you pursue with such a measure will determine your approach in many ways. So if your policy objective is to try to raise the ambition of countries' NDCs, you might take a country by country analysis. If your policy objective is to outcompete countries that you think are not trading fairly, you might look at some kind of plurilateral approach that distinguishes between some countries and other countries. But the policy objective, at least in the impact assessment and the way in which the van der Leyen Commission has been describing it, is to ensure that there is no carbon leakage in the context of the production processes of energy intensive industries in Europe. And so that does require you to think, I believe, on a product by product basis, and look not so much in terms of the level of ambition of an NDC, though we may characterize that from a political perspective, but instead to look at the carbon rates associated with the production of a particular product or class of products. So that seems to me leads you down the road in a particular direction. In terms of the policy instrument that you might use to achieve that border adjustment with regard to that particular product, that is more open in terms of the Commission's approach to the proposal, and could include, as I said before, the use of a tax or a tariff, or it could use the approach of expanding the scope of the ETS. But it's absolutely critical that you have, first and foremost in your mind, what is your policy objective?
Okay. Mike, take it away.
All right. Well, we see some questions popping up. I'll start with Florian Dieriks of the Federal Belgian Government, because you actually had already submitted it in the chat function, but now please.
And we happen to be in Belgium anyway.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the interesting discussion. I listened with great interest to all the talks, and I have a lot of ideas and questions popping up. But one which popped up in the beginning was some related, it's probably direct towards Jacob Worksman from the Commission. I was wondering to which extent, I will be looking with great interest to the ongoing Inception impact assessment, but I was wondering if you already have like data sets in mind to use for carbon flows, transboundary carbon flows. And I have one paper in mind which appeared at the end of last year from the Norwegian NTNU, who compared all the existing input-output carbon border flow data sets. And one of their main conclusions was that the error is not that high and it should be ready to be used for policy, and that like data uncertainties are getting low enough to be used. I was wondering, do you consider these input-output data sets to be used in the carbon border tax? And then a second question is, you mentioned taxes, tariffs, and possibly expanding the ETS in this regard. But I was also wondering if product norms and like specific like emission standards for product norms are also considered in the discussion at the moment. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Florian. And I'll follow on one other one from Ando Möldre of Eesti Energia in Estonia. Please, Ando. Still muted.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting event indeed. I am perhaps targeting my question to Jacob and Genevieve regarding the abolition of free allowances to industry in the case of carbon measures, carbon border measures. There are industries in the European Union which are included in the emission trading scheme and which are exporting their production mainly globally, not on EU internal market, but globally. How would you regard these industries to be protected after the carbon measures would be enforced and after the cancellation of free allowances? How would you regard these industries to be protected on the global market? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Any volunteers to take these questions? And obviously, especially the last question is one that I'm sure you've heard many, many times. There's a lot of concern precisely about that. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. There we go, John and Jake. Let's start with John.
Well, I can simply point out the example that we have just talked about and the slide that I shared. In the case of the regulation that applies to essentially to the reducing the combustion emissions of our products, the Renewable Energy Directive, as I've said, that applies to everything that is passing through the market entry point in Europe. What is interesting is that the fuels, there's a small amount of fuels that is exported by the European refining sector. It's mostly some surplus gasoline, largely because Europe went down a road of having a lot more diesel vehicles in the last decade, and a small amount of the gasoline now goes and tries to find a market in different parts of the world. The fuel that is exported from Europe does not have to comply with the Renewable Energy Directive before it goes out of Europe. Where it lands to another location, it will have to comply with local regulation. So, for example, if that fuel goes to California, it will be subject to meeting the California low carbon fuel standard, which is in some ways similar to the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe. And so we can illustrate that that's a possible way that this could work in the future. And again, it's all down to having a regulation that is close to the market rather than close to the manufacturing.
And Jake, I heard that I saw that you had briefly raised your hand.
Well, only because the question was at least in part directed at me, so I feel I have an obligation to say something. I mean, first is to say that I'm not involved in the technical elements or aspects of the impact assessment. The only data set that is mentioned currently in the framework of the assessment so far is the OECD data set and the experience that we've had already in assessing carbon leakage in the context of the ETS. But I would encourage those that have data that they want to draw the attention of the assessment to provide that in the context of the feedback period or the public consultation period that will come. The question about product standards, are those being used as well in order to achieve the European Green Deal? Absolutely. These were already being put in place under the existing less ambitious target in the context of automobile emissions, energy efficiency standards, and the kinds of fuel-related standards that John's presentation described as well. Those are a very important part of the way in which you gain market access to the EU and your products can be used for purposes such as meeting renewable energy targets. And my guess is that as we revise the legislation to achieve the more ambitious target, we will be looking at product-related standards as well. A little bit of a different issue than border carbon adjustment, but nonetheless relevant. On the issue of whether a border carbon adjustment proposal will include a rebate for exporters, I assume that will be something that the impact assessment will be looking at, because it's a characteristic, at least in terms of academic proposals, for how border carbon adjustment mechanisms could be designed. But I don't know specifically how it would be looked at. It definitely, all of this in terms of the potential economic impact will take into account the way in which the ETS currently addresses carbon leakage through the free allocation of allowances.
Great, thank you, Jake. And I saw that Genevieve had raised her hand. She wanted to also
but
join
I think
in.
Arunaba was first. He signaled.
Okay, sorry, I didn't catch it. Then let's go in the sequence, Arunaba and then Genevieve. Arunaba, yeah, you're still muted?
Yeah, no.
Perfect.
Let me know. So, sorry for butting in the queue. It's pretty late in the evening for me, and I need to go and put my daughter to bed. So, if you wouldn't mind, I just wanted to make a couple of points. Someone had written a question to me, which is, what's the perception in India of the EU CBAM debate? Is it seen as a protectionist tool? And I think in my response to the earlier question, I'd already said that, yes, I mean, there would be one instinctive reaction, which would be that, yes, this is protectionist. But if you unpack it, there might be room for maneuver. But a more important question is something I wanted to point to, something I wanted to speak about in response to the framing that Jake put forward just a few minutes ago. It's just, what is the policy objective? And I agree, I like that framing. Is it about enhancing your NDCs, or is it about changing the emissions footprint at a sectoral level? The challenge, however, is that these are not completely distinct, because once you ignore, what's happening at a national level and only focus at the sectoral level, then you open up a debate about all the sectors where one might or might not have competitive advantage or disadvantage. So at one level, India would argue that, look, currently we are producing more electricity from renewable sources than the United States is. Less than the EU, but more than the US, more than China in absolute generation terms. We could also argue that our NDCs are on track for not just being met, but are on track for a 2-degree world, which is not the case with others. So there has to be some mechanism which acknowledges that and rewards that action. But at a sectoral level, then, it opens up all sorts of questions. The points that John has been talking about, say, from the petroleum product space. India is a very large petrochemical industry. So what happens to those exports? But then there are competitive advantages. For instance, cement. We have the lowest footprint cement because we have some of the newest cement plant fleet in the world. So will we have access to that market? Or let's take HFCs. There has been this growing debate, not just about phase down of HFCs, but what kind of refrigerants. Now, Indian companies have started using natural refrigerants, which are significantly lower global warming footprint. But the barrier in the US or the EU market is a technical barrier. It's not a barrier about emissions footprint. So it really depends, even if we move towards a sectoral route, it will depend on, are we only looking at a tariff-based story? Are we looking at standards, technical barriers, and all sorts of other things that could be then perceived as, look, we are doing what we can do, and we would love to trade with you on where you have an advantage and we have an advantage, but that's not what is really working out now. So we can iron out those kinks. I still think that the post-2015 world, notwithstanding all the challenges we faced of late with, say, the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, does open up an opportunity for a more mature conversation around a global carbon price and the best way to level the playing field. So let me stop there. And once again, thank you for inviting me. If you don't mind, I'm going to sign out now.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
and
Arunava.
thank you,
Andre.
Arunava. And yeah, and I hand over to Genevieve with apologies. That Arunava had signaled that he had father duties, so I wanted to free him for that. So apologies, Genevieve. Please go ahead. And you'll have
Okay.
the last word because we are over time, but please go ahead and then we'll.
Yes. So I would like to come back on something which is very important and a point that Jake made already also. It's about objective. So the objective is to avoid carbon leakage. Why? Because the overall objective is to reduce CO2 emissions at global level. So if we want to reduce carbon leakage, this will guide our answers to more technical questions. For instance, the question of how to calculate the adjustment mechanism. Take the example of electricity. It will be part of the CO2 intensity of this electricity, this particular type of electricity. For instance, how is it produced in Morocco? What is the part of coal? What is the part of renewables? So it's first point is CO2 intensity of the product, and second is CO2 price. But CO2 price including the regulations, because it's not only do they have an ETS, do they have a carbon tax? It's also the kind of regulation that they have to respect. And the final word maybe I would like to make, because you invite me to have a final word, is that we consider that the BCAs have a role to play, especially because it has been announced and it is feasible. But what we would like to say is that it is part of a toolbox, and we will come back on other tools like greening of trade agreements, which is a very promising one, or market instruments. There is a strong market power in the EU. We are still the biggest internal market in the world, and so we should use our normative power to raise the bar, and it will have effects everywhere in the world. I give you one example. REACH regulation has had effects everywhere in the world. So we will come back as Institut Jacques Delors, Europe Jacques Delors, we will come back on these two aspects, greening trade agreements and the question of the market power of the EU. Thank you.
Well, look, it is 20 minutes over time, and Jake asked me how long. I said 5:30 max. I didn't keep my word, so apologies for those of you. Arunava had father duty, so I had to deal with that. But it's fascinating to have such a combination of people on the same screen. We couldn't have them in the same room, but at least we have them on the same screen. And for this, Michael and I and ERCST are super grateful. We will continue our work. We will cooperate with Jacques Delors Institute, with Bruegel, with all think tanks and everyone in Europe and across the board that in the US that is interested in this conversation, because we think it's important. I think this has the ability to either make it or break it, because it's all about the environment, but in the end it's who pays the bill and how who takes the economic pain and how it's divided, and that is going to make a difference. So we thank you both, all of you, from both Michael and myself. Thank you all for taking the time. And just as Genevieve said, we'll be back, and we'll be in touch, and you'll hear from you. Mike, any last word from you?
No, thanks to everybody. 3 continents all on one screen. It is remarkable, and it works.
Thank you, and thank you to Jude, and thank you to Jude.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.